Romans 12, starting at verse 1 till verse 8, and it's on page 800. Okay, does anyone know what last Wednesday was? Ash Wednesday. Yeah, well done. National holiday, really? We should be petitioning for that in this country, I think. Maybe Shrove Tuesday would be nicer as a holiday. It's pancakes, Tracy. So, it's Ash Wednesday, last Wednesday. Oh, they're back. That's fine. And therefore, we're in Lent. And that's why this passage is on the preaching plan for this Sunday, because it is the first Sunday in Lent. By the way, adults or young people, if you find it very difficult to engage with what I'm talking about, there is a colouring table at the back there. So do feel free. Rob is sitting right next to it, yes. So this is why this passage is on here. But of course, with yesterday and with us thinking about our communities and how we can be a part of it, or part of them rather, and how we can reach out to the networks we're involved in, this passage is also very, very relevant. But I'm not so much going to focus on the last 6 verses of this passage. I'm going to focus on the first 2, particularly, because the last 6 are very much around the kind of gifts that we are given and exploring what those are. And all of that, though, stems from the first 2 verses. And without those first 2 verses, it really doesn't make much sense. Or actually, it does make sense. But what you end up in is burnout land or arrogant land if you don't understand the first 2 verses. Because basically, you'll be trying to do these things without any solid foundation, without the rock to stand on, and without any kind of feeding or input. So I want to unpack these first 2 verses in detail, really, over the next 15 to 20 minutes before we take communion together. And I hope, as I do this, what I want you to bear in mind is both Lent and this period of time where, as Joe was saying a couple of days ago, as we were talking about the service, Lent in recent years has become less about giving things up and more about giving things out. And I think that's the right thing. I think that's a good change. That often when we just give things up, like the traditional thing of giving up chocolate or whatever it might be for Lent, it's all about us and about us making ourselves better and us making ourselves feel better about ourselves. Whereas actually Lent should be about sacrifice in the sense of we're giving out because we're giving something up. It might be time, it might be finance, it might be lots of different things. We're giving something up so that we can give out and other people benefit. And I think that's a much better approach to Lent than the self-focused navel-gazing that we used to have. So bear that in mind as I'm talking about this passage, but also bear in mind what we are talking about as a church, an ongoing conversation about what it is that we individually should be doing. And I want you to bear those things in mind because I also want you to think about how you do those things and on what basis. I don't think any of us should get caught up in trying to do it all ourselves. Well, that's not only I don't think, you shouldn't. It's not a good idea because you will burn out. So, first of all, it starts with God's mercy, this passage, which is obviously where we need to start. So, where do we see, and by the way, this is going to be interactive. I'm not going to do all the talking. I expect you to respond. Where do we see God's mercy most obviously demonstrated? In Christ, how? Oh, sorry, do you say on the cross? Sorry. So, yes, on the cross. That sacrifice was God's mercy for us. Without starting from there isn't a lot of point to what we're doing. Or a bit like John was saying to yesterday when he talked about the idea of a 3D church. You end up just being a social service, and in that process you are going to burn yourself out because you're going to find there's so much that needs doing and you're not going to know what it is specifically that you've been called to, and nor are you going to have any spiritual input, any feeding behind what you're doing. So we have to start from the point of God's mercy. Can anyone spot where else mercy is mentioned in this passage? Yes, I wake up, pay attention. This is interactive. Where else is mercy mentioned in this passage? Yes, it is. At the end. In verse 8, where it talks about cheerfully cheerfully. I don't know how many of us do this cheerfully. Show mercy cheerfully. That's a really interesting idea, isn't it? So if you think about that, showing mercy in essence means forgiving people for things they've hurt you over or with or whatever. How cheerfully do you forgive people? It's interesting. I'm not sure I've ever done that. So that's a big challenge to me. But what was also very interesting around this, I'm going to talk a little bit about Sorry? Yeah, that's okay. If you must, Catherine. So rude. Yes, Catherine. No, it isn't. Okay, go on. Develop that a little bit further then. So what else is it? Apart from yes, good. So you don't have to forgive people. Yes, you could be compassionate to people who are suffering. Thank you. Tracy, you were going to say something? No. Yes. No, but at some point, I mean, cheerfully, we have a very British understanding, I think, of what cheerfully is. You know, it's very smiley and happy. But if you go further, what? If you go further back with what cheerfully actually means, it means with cheer, which basically means with goodwill. So you're not forgiving and kind of holding a bit back and going, yeah, but I don't really like you. You're actually doing it with goodwill. And I think if we think of it that way, even at the beginning of a long process of forgiveness, we can have that attitude. The interesting thing, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Greek words behind some of this, which I won't be able to pronounce. But the Greek word for mercy in the first verse is different from the Greek word for mercy in verse 8. And I think that's really interesting. Because the Greek word for mercy in the first verse is oiktimos or something like that. Whereas in the last verse it's ilioi. And I probably said both those words wrong. That isn't really important. But the first word is about a deep inward mercy, something that comes from the guts, deep down, and is almost wrenched out. Not unwillingly, but it's so painful. It's a total identification with the person with whom you are showing mercy. The second one is not from the same depth. Now, I think we could spend a whole morning now exploring why that's the case, and I don't want to, because there are other things I want to say as well. But I think we need to bear that in mind, because sometimes, and bearing in mind what Tracy's just said, sometimes when we feel we need to forgive other people, we feel like we need to be like Christ, and we need to forgive in the same depth. You can't. You're not God. You're not capable of it. You're not capable of making that sacrifice. And I've certainly been caught up in a position where I've wondered whether I've really forgiven someone because I haven't really felt that gut-wrenching kind of compassion. I've just said it. And that's okay. That's all right to have mercy like that. I was having a conversation with someone this week who has had to forgive someone over something very, very, very big in their life, absolutely massive. And it's taken a long time, but this week he said to me, do you know what? I've forgiven them. And I said, how do you know? He said, because I've stopped thinking about it. And it wasn't like a massive gut-wrenching thing he had to do, and I think part of it was that he thought it was. He had to do that for it to be real. You can't do that, and we're not called to do that, but we are called to choose to forgive. But it doesn't have to be in the same depth, because we are not God. We can't be Christ on the cross to other people. And dare I say it, if we think we can, we're being arrogant. Because we're not capable of that, and we're not called to it. I thought it was a really interesting point. I'd never noticed that before. But these two words for mercy are completely different. And so we start, in terms of being a sacrifice, from the point of view of knowing what God has done for us, that we are incapable of doing for ourselves or anyone else. It's beyond us. And with that beauty and that knowledge, then we're able to be called to something that is very challenging. Okay, the next phrase I just want to explore a little bit more is the whole thing about bodies. Why is there such a focus on bodies at the beginning of this passage? That we offer our bodies as living sacrifices? Well, it's partly to do with the culture. It's partly to do with the fact that the Greek people, the Roman people here are very intellectually based and don't necessarily value the body as much as the mind. And I think Paul is making a point about that. But I think also for us, perhaps more relevant, is we spend a lot of time thinking about our bodies, dare I say it. And some of us perhaps spending a lot of time thinking about other people's bodies, but let's move on from that. So we spend a lot of time being very physically focused because it's very tangible. And that's how we identify people. And Paul is not asking us to put that to one side. It is that our bodies cost us. Sometimes they hurt us. Sometimes it takes time for us to keep them in good trim. Sometimes they cause us pain, and actually when we don't want to be ill, they make us ill. All sorts of things go wrong. Our bodies are a very tangible thing, and it's important that we recognize that they're part of our lives. So Paul makes them a focus, and he talks about them being a living sacrifice. And of course, then he brings in the idea of body to be a representation of us as a group of people together, a community, and he transfers us from the individualistic thing of I've got to look after myself to saying, well, the same care you give to yourself, you need to be giving to the people around you who also have bodies that are different from yours and also have different purposes to the way that they live their lives. And in both cases, Christ is the head, not just of the community, but also of your own body. As what you choose to do with your own body should be a response to the fact that Jesus is the head of it. Okay, it isn't just about a community of people. So the two things linked together. But the really important thing about this is this word offer. Offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. God never makes us do anything. I don't know if you ever feel sometimes it would be great if he did. Then I wouldn't have to worry. If he just told me and made me and confronted me and I had no choice, that would be wonderful. And there are many times in my life where I wish God had done that, but he doesn't. Because he respects the creation he's made, which is you as a person, as an individual who has complete free will to choose as you do. I've been reading, and I think I've mentioned it before, a book about Elijah by Jeff Lucas that I'd highly recommend. It came out at the end of last year. And Elijah is a wonderful character. I don't know how much you know of his story. There's a brilliant story in itself, and maybe we should study him at some point as a church. But Elijah keeps being put in positions where he's given choice and free will, even though it's quite clear what God wants him to do, but he won't make him. Now, I'm sure you know the story about when Elijah, after all the prophets of Baal have been put to death and proved completely wrong, runs away because Jezebel said she's going to kill him. And he kind of accepts that, even though he knows what God has just done and how much God could protect him. And he runs off and hides in a cave, possibly a cave that Moses was in when he went up the mountain and met with God. He goes and hides there, and God passes by in an earthquake, in wind, and in fire, and then invites Elijah to come outside the cave to meet with him. He speaks with him in the cave, but he invites him to come outside the cave. Now, it's a tiny thing, perhaps, but if you can find it, it's in 1 Kings chapter 19. The first two verses, is it? Hang on. No, it's verses 12 and 13, sorry. 19, it's on page 255 in these Bibles. I don't want to spend too long on this, but I think it's just worth picking up on this. So, okay, so I'm just trying to find the right bit, because I didn't put the right reference down. Okay, so if you can find verse 12 near the top of page 255, it's the third paragraph down. It says, after the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire, and after the fire came a gentle whisper. Interestingly, we don't know what God said at that point. It almost feels like it's too intimate for us to know. But something was said. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. And then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Okay, two things there. Firstly, there's a gentle whisper. And in response to that, Elijah goes out and stands at the mouth of the cave. God doesn't want to speak to him in the cave. Clearly, something was said which invited Elijah to move. to get to the mouth of the cave. Now, that may seem like a really small thing, but if you can think of a cave in a metaphorical sense, we can be inside our cave. We can be hiding in whatever situation it might be, and we might be saying to God, meet me here, do something here. I often find that God says, no, you need to take a step. You need to come out. I'm not going to tell you what's going to happen, but you need to come out. That's free will. He's giving you a choice. He's not going to overcome whatever it is that you're making your cave. He's inviting you to come out. And then secondly, he asks a question. God always does that. I've found he hardly ever gives answers. Even if he seems to, it's another question. God's really good at questions. And he knows the answer. He knows perfectly well what Elijah is doing there. But he wants Elijah to say it so that Elijah recognizes it himself. Okay, now how does that relate to this passage? If you are offering yourself as a living sacrifice, you need to step out. You can't just do it in whatever situation you're in, because there isn't much sacrifice in that. Sacrifice requires you to do something new, to step out. And secondly, God is going to ask you. He's not going to tell you. He's going to ask you, what do you want to do? Okay, and he's going to ask you that because you already know. But he wants you to recognize it. That's being a living sacrifice. Does that make sense? These things, by the way, as I often say, I'm preaching to myself because I'm starting to realize these things myself. I can't stay where I am and expect God to meet me there. I have to step out. And then I have to wait for the question. And I know the question will reveal an answer that makes sense. Important thing here, actually no, I should say this bit first. There's this phrase, spiritual act of worship, at the end of the first verse back in Romans 12. Really big, grand phrase. The King James Version terms it reasonable service, which is a completely different phrase. So I don't know where the spiritual act of worship stuff has come from. It's actually reasonable service. But I'd like you to bear both of those phrases alongside each other because it's quite useful. And in the King James, what it means is it's sensible. It is sensible to be a living sacrifice because that's what you should be to live your life as a Christian. Otherwise, and the spiritual act of worship sounds very grand, doesn't it? But on the other hand, it is pretty grand because what we're being called to is stuff that will transform the world around us. But bear in mind reasonable service as well. It would be unreasonable to not do this, if I can put it that way. The other thing I'd like to point out to you is a word that you skip over because you get the second word first. We spot the word sacrifice, we miss the word living. This is not a dead sacrifice. It's a living sacrifice, ongoing with life. It wasn't once living like the dead parrot sketch and now is no more. It still is living. That's really important because if you sacrifice yourself in the wrong way, you will kill yourself, metaphorically or literally. You'll drive yourself into the ground. God does not require that of you. He requires you to be a living sacrifice who continues to exist as part of the network you're in. And if you are finding yourself destroyed by what you're doing, you've got something wrong. That's not the right place to be, and you need to have a chat with God about it. So bear that in mind. Too often we kind of go for the sacrifice and we forget the living part of it as well. Okay, going back to spiritual act of worship, it's an act of worship because in choosing to do this, you're setting yourself apart. Now there's another couple of things I want to point out here. This is perhaps unexpected, but very challenging too. When it talks about not conforming any more to the pattern of the world in verse 2, the word conform, which is another word I can't possibly pronounce, but I'm going to have a go and embarrass myself anyway, which is, I should be clicking this on, shouldn't I? Sorry, I forgot about that. Oh, those verses you can look up because that's going back to you making a choice. Ephesians 4:24 is about you choosing to put a new self on, and the other one, working out your salvation with fear and trembling. That's about choice. I was going to do a bit of a rant about Macbeth, but we haven't got time for that. So we'll go on. Sorry? Macbeth. You don't need Shakespeare, not something. So, well, you always need Shakespeare. You don't even write. This is so hard sometimes. I know you all too well. This is the problem. You can push all the right buttons. So, conforming. This word is about transforming from the outside. And the word in Greek is something like suskematizo. And it is actually, this is a bit weird. That word is about transforming your outward appearance. And very often we can focus on the inward spiritual and miss the outward. What this basically is saying, when it's talking about no longer conforming to the pattern of the world, you should look different. You should not look the same as other people around you. Okay, now I thought about that and I thought, so how does that look different, particularly in the workplace? I think the challenge for many of us who are working at the moment is everyone around us is overworking like mad. Why are they overworking like mad? Partly for money, partly out of guilt, partly because they think they should. But actually, I think one of the challenges we have to take on board, which sounds counterintuitive, is to work less, those of us who are working too much. And I'm one of them, by the way. And I will be soon, and that's going to be a challenge for a lot of you. But you need to work less. You need to be doing less because the world will continue to get into this spiral of being out of control if we continue to go along with it. It's not right, it's not healthy, and it really struck me yesterday what John and Anne were saying, that we have a divided community now. Those who are working far too much and those who aren't working at all. And there's very little in between, and both of those are wrong. And we need to be setting a new pattern. And part of our transformation should be about how we approach work and how we approach all the things to do with our lives, around our housing, around what we regard as important. Those are not surface things. This passage tells us doing those things differently will show the world there is a difference. That's important to bear in mind. And I suppose ultimately it comes down to what's your priority. Is your priority earning a lot of money and satisfying your boss? And if that's the case, who is your boss? Because it's not your boss. Your boss is Jesus. And how do you satisfy him? And it's not by killing yourself by overworking. So that's a big, big challenge. And this passage, again, because of this word, is also about outward transformation. It is about inward transformation too, about the renewing of your mind at the end of that verse. And the word behind this is a much easier word to pronounce. It's metamorphoo. And which, there's a foo at the end of it. Which is satisfying. But metamorphosis is about change, but think of a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. Although they look completely different, the caterpillar contained everything the butterfly was going to be. And I like that because the idea of metamorphosis is the fact that God takes what you are and makes it better. He doesn't change you to something you weren't already. And I used to be terrified of that when I was a young Christian. I thought I would have to suddenly become somebody who wore ridiculous clothes and bad jumpers. It's all right. And actually, you need to deal with Joe on that. It was a Christmas present, Io. Talk to my wife. You did. I set that one up. And you... Okay. So, but the point is, you're not being asked to be who you're not already. And the wonderful thing... Okay, sorry, I will let you speak, Miranda. But the wonderful thing about metamorphosis is you actually discover it's great being what God called you to be. Is that what you were going to say? Yes. Yes, and I'd agree with that, but the outward change would have been not so much in what you wore, but in your attitude to the things you did. Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, of course. Exactly. And I mean, in my first 6 weeks of university, because I was doing drama, I had my ear pierced, which was more revelatory then, or more unusual then than it is now. But I then, when I became again recommitted as a Christian, thought, have I got to unpierce my ear? But that was just silly, because actually it was a bit like Hudson Taylor fitting in with the Chinese community. It was part of me fitting in with the drama department, and it meant that I was saying I was part of them as much as being a Christian. And that you could be both. So, thank you. I mean, I think that's important. Okay, there's not a lot more I want to say. The last big thing I want to put before you, though, is at the end of verse 2, it talks about us being able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Test and approve. Really interesting words. How are we testing and approving his will? I think, basically, this is about us showing the world what it's like to be someone who is a living sacrifice, fully committed to God. And the testing and approving is partly for us, and God's saying, don't worry, I can stand up to that. My will is perfect, and it's not going to be a problem for you. Yeah, should I have flicked on? Can't remember what the next slide was. Yeah, there we go. But it's also about the world being able to see that this way is better. And they will be able to test and approve through the way that you are and the kind of living sacrifice you are, that actually this is a better way to be. And again, these were the things we were talking about yesterday and that Anne was bringing before us. How did people know that God was there? They talked about the love. They talked about the words that they were given. They talked about the interaction between the different people as part of that community. A lot of it, have you noticed, the things that were talked about were being things. They weren't doing things. They were about the attitude of the people that were there. And again, we could get so caught up into all the things we do and forget the fact that we just need to be. And sometimes, and I've been challenged a lot by a friend about this recently, sometimes as Christians we go into a situation to make it better or to make it work or to solve a problem. And actually, sometimes that's the last thing you should do. Because people who are in difficult situations either just need you to be there, to listen, to get alongside them, or they already know what they should do. But they just need someone to affirm them in it. And to take over and to try and solve a situation is actually quite arrogant. And I don't think we're often called to do that. So I'm trying to learn to be rather than to try and fix all the time. Because understandably, we want people's lives to get better. But they've got to give us permission before we can actually do anything around that. So testing and approving is about us showing the world what it is when God's kingdom comes in our lives, amongst us individually, but also as a body. And as I said, I'm not going to spend any time really on the last 6 verses, but the important thing to note about them is there are lots of different gifts there. And they are gifts. So if you can prophesy, brilliant. If you can teach, brilliant. If you can encourage, wonderful. And if you can give generously, wonderful. But you know what? It's not because you're great that you can do those things. It's because God gave you those gifts. So don't get arrogant about it. And therefore also don't get jealous of other people who do things that you think you would like to do. They've got that gift, but it isn't about them. It's about God's kingdom working in the body of the community that is there. And instead of being jealous or arrogant, we should be really happy that God is doing amazing things amongst us. Joe made the point as we were praying before today's service, and it hadn't occurred to me till Joe said it, that all the words that went up on the board yesterday about us as a body were positive. And nobody said, but we're not doing that. That's really lovely, because that shows me that God's kingdom is at work amongst us. It should not make us proud. It should not make us think, aren't we great because we're great? What it should make us is absolutely blessed by the fact that God is at work amongst us. And it's evident in the way that we see ourselves and that others see us at times. One last quote I'm going to leave you with. I think it comes next. You're not clicking. Do the thing. I want to give it, no, keep going. Okay, I've said that. Right, this. Let's have a look at that quote. I've been reading quite a lot of Bonhoeffer recently. Oh, thank you. Wonderful, thanks. So, just have a think about it. Bonhoeffer's challenging because he writes in German, obviously, and so the translation sometimes challenges you because it looks a little bit awkward, but then it draws you into what's actually being said. It said, obedience to Jesus' call is never an autonomous human deed. Okay, autonomous means on your own. What this means to me is that you choosing to respond to Jesus is not about you doing it on your own. So who are you doing it with? In the first instance, you're doing it with Jesus. In the second instance, you're doing it with the body that you're a part of. In this case, the stable. Okay? And I think that's really important because taking this idea of living sacrifice, I don't think any of you will do this, but you could all go away now and think, okay, I now need to go and do this thing because I know there's a problem. You shouldn't be doing that unless Jesus has told you to. So the first thing you should do if you have that thought is check it out with God and see, have you got the peace, that gut peace that comes with knowing you're doing the right thing? And if you haven't, you need to keep talking to God about it. And maybe it isn't for you to do. If you do it by yourself, you're back in the world of arrogance and burnout. And that's not the place you want to be. Okay? So when we look at the word living sacrifice and we think about Lent and we think about the people who we may come across, don't try and just do this by yourself. We're going to do a little activity in a moment. Are we? Are we running out of time if I talk to them? Okay. Well, we could offer it as a possibility, Joan, to see what people think. But if we do or not, don't do the activity, irrelevant. But whatever you're called to in Lent, don't do it just because it's a good idea. To use a well-worn phrase, it has to be a God idea. And it should not be just on your own. Okay, I've said enough. I'm going to hand back to Joe.